Hi and welcome back to the channel. Let's talk about apocalypses because we've all kind of been thinking about them secretly for the past year and a half, and it's always good fun to see an old school apocalypse from the 1950s or the 1960s and just see how they looked at the end of the world, which isn't to say that the COVID-19 pandemic is going to be the end of the world, but it gave us a good scare. Looking back at safer and more distant apocalypses might be called for. Now I'm going to dip in first into the 1950s, 1951 in fact, and a movie by the legendary producer George Pal. George Pal's influence on science fiction cinema cannot be overestimated. He's the guy that all of the people whose movies you like was inspired by. He's the man who gave us The Time Machine and gave us War of the Worlds and gave us Destination Moon. He was a great producer and a great creative mind, but he wasn't tough in the way that you have to be a certain kind of Hollywood movie producer. And so a lot of his projects never got through because he didn't push them through with the suits. And as we know, the suits in Hollywood are always the problem. So I decided to go with a movie of his I first saw when I was a kid, and it impressed me a lot because it was probably the first time I thought about the end of the world. And it is the wonderful When Worlds Collide from 1951, starring Richard Gere, Barbara Rush, Larry Keating, John Hoyt, and a host of others. Now, this is the imprint version of it. The imprint version is the preferred one because apart from anything else, the internal slipcover looks even cooler than the outside one. It's got the beautiful iconic rocket here, designed by the production designer Chesney Bonestell, who did a lot of the astronomical pictures for this movie. Chesney Bonestell was the astronomical artist for the 20th century. He was the first person to try to do paintings of what life would be like on other planets, or what the landscapes would be like on other planets. Bonestell's work is lovely to look at. It's not scientifically accurate from what we now know. He was using his imagination as much as he could, the available materials, and his influence on this one is pretty profound. So the story is fairly simple. A pilot, Dave Randall, is asked to transport some astronomical photographic plates from South Africa to New York so they can be appraised. And when he gets there, he finds out that the thing they're looking at is a star and a planet that are hurtling towards the Earth on a collision course, and that the world is going to be destroyed in about 8 or 9 months. He also meets a beautiful female scientist called Joyce, played by Barbara Rush, and her fiance, who's a doctor. And there's that usual kind of love triangle things you've got to pump into one of these movies. The scientists decide that what they're going to do is try to create a rocket ship from the ground up and take some people from Earth, which is going to be destroyed, to the planet Zyra, which is going to be okay after the collision with Belus, the star, and the Earth. The star is going to collide with the Earth. There's another planet there and they can hop over to that if they can get a rocket built in time. Now, the government doesn't want to do it because all of the senators are scientific illiterates. Not that that would happen in the 21st century. And so a bunch of businessmen throw their money into the project, including a guy in a wheelchair. His name is Stanton. He's played by John Hoyt, and he is marvelous in this movie. He's nasty, cynical, but realistic in some ways as well. And he decides to finance the project. The project goes ahead, and nobody believes that this star is going to collide with the Earth. The planet Zyra is going to pass the Earth and create enormous earthquakes and eruptions, but nobody believes that until it actually happens because people don't believe the science, which again is something that wouldn't happen in the 21st century. The project goes ahead and they have their great big slippery dip kind of launching platform for the rocket, which doesn't work scientifically, but it looks great. A group of people do end up going there. They get to the planet, and the planet's got air and the planet's got life. Hey, I just had a good question. If Zyra was circling around Belus, why was it frozen? Because Belus is supposed to be a star and stars are supposed to keep things warm. So why was everything frozen on Zyra? Maybe it was further away from its star than Earth was. No, I'm not going to get into the science of this. It's going to confuse the hell out of me. It's just going to mess things up. So the spaceship takes off, it gets there, and then about 45 people, about 40 people live happily ever after, while the rest of us are gone. And the 40 white people. So But having said that, it's not too much of a spoiler to say that they get there and that they find a new world, and you've got that Eden thing. The movie starts out with a picture of the Holy Bible and a biblical quote in it and all that kind of thing. And that's the way that they used to wrap audiences in cotton wool for this kind of movie, by reminding them that according to the belief system of the majority of people watching the movie, that everyone was going to heaven who got smashed by a giant star. Some of us don't believe that, and that's okay too. Some of us believe other things, and that's okay too. But the weird thing about 1950s studios movies are, for the most part, they were very, very white, and they were very Christian, and they catered to the cultural norms of who they perceived as their audience. Now, of course, their audience was international. Their audience was from a whole bunch of different belief systems. But the suits, again, messed things up. The suits made it a little bit monocultural. Now, there was some talk about other rocket ships from other nations being built, but we don't hear about them after the little bit of a box tick saying, yeah, other people are going to get away too. But this movie definitely focuses on the American one. And the love triangle kind of works well. It really does play a little more realistically than a lot of these kind of movies. And rather than the two males in the love triangle being antagonistic toward each other, they kind of come to an agreement and they accept the decision of the woman, which is always nice. So it's nice that she gets to say who she spends the rest of her life with. The movie was based on a book by Edwin Bulmer and Philip Wiley called When Worlds Collide. There was also a sequel called After Worlds Collide, which was about the colony on the new planet. And the book had been around since the early 1930s, and one of the things that the commentary track tells us, the rocket that goes from Earth to Zyra, which has got another name, Bronson B or something like that, in the book, also carries Marlene Dietrich among other people. So that's kind of interesting that she turns up as a space passenger in a science fiction novel, but they didn't get Marlene Dietrich for this one, didn't have the budget for it. And I think she was working in Germany or doing cabaret in Europe at the time, so they probably couldn't have got her anyway. But anyway, leaving that digression aside, does the movie work? Yeah, it works. The special effects were cutting edge for its time. There are a few matte lines around some of the special effects sequences, but less than I've seen in a lot of other movies of this kind. The acting is pretty on point too. Richard Durr, I think, is underrated in this one, playing the hotshot pilot guy. He's a lot of fun and he really commits to the role. There are also a couple of nice little extras in there. If you keep your eyes open, you can see Roy Thinnes, who was in The Invaders, as one of the people in the background who gets maybe one line of dialogue. And we also see the first film role of Stuart Whitman, who went on to do wonderful things like wrestling baboons in Sands of the Kalahari. But the most valuable player in this is John Hoyt, playing Stanton, the billionaire in the wheelchair, who things don't end well for him, let's put it that way. So I remember that scene at the end of it where he's watching the rocket start to leave and stands up in his wheelchair and takes a step or two. And at the time, like a lot of people, I thought he was faking being disabled. But as we now know, and as we can see through the lens of our greater knowledge of these things, people in wheelchairs can often take a few steps, but the problem is they can't take more than a few steps. So that scene plays differently to my eyes now than it did the first time I saw it years ago. And I've got a bit more of a nuanced view about disability. The guy's still an utter prick, of course, and nasty and selfish and self-serving and with no redeeming qualities at all. But in spite of that, Stanton's still a bastard, but he's a really interesting bastard to watch. So did the movie hold up as well now as it did when I was a kid? Well, it holds up differently. When I was a kid, it was mind-blowing because I'd never seen a movie like this before. I'd never seen a movie where the world gets destroyed. I'd never seen a movie with groovy rockets like that. I'd never seen the urgency of handling an apocalypse the way I have in When Worlds Collide. So these days, I like it. I like the historical context of it. I like watching the actors kind of using the dialogue to inform their characters. Which ones are just going through the motions, which ones are actually committing to it. And Richard Durr and Larry Keating in particular really do that, along with John Hoyt. Barbara Rush's role is a little kind of generic, but that's not her fault. She does commit to the role. and the special effects and the honesty of it as a piece of science fiction, and that ongoing message which we have to keep hammering into ourselves as the decades continue of following the science, is still one worth checking out. Imprint have done a lovely version on this one. There's a commentary with Barry Forshaw and Kim Newman. There's a whole bunch of interviews about and with Gene Roddenberry, Ray Bradbury, Ray Harryhausen, Roy Disney, Ward Chang, Russ Templin and Duke Goldstone about George Pal. So this really commits to continuing the truth of George Pal's influence on science fiction. And there's a trailer and a photo gallery as well. And this is a 1080p presentation from a 4K scan of the 35mm original. So this movie has been preserved wonderfully. And that always reassures me when science fiction history, particularly in cinema, is maintained and preserved in the best possible way. That's When Worlds Collide from 1951. Let's move on to 1961. Let's move across the Atlantic. Let's do widescreen black and white. This movie was preserved by the British Film Institute, and good on them for that, not just preserving the kind of classy films. It was directed by Val Guest and written by Val Guest and Wolf Mankiewicz, and it is a movie that I saw probably in VHS days and really loved and continue to love to this day, because I think it's honest. I think it's got an interesting take on things. And it is The Day the Earth Caught Fire, starring Edward Judd, Janet Munro and Leo McKern from 1961. And the blurb says, "It goes off like a bomb in your lap." So basically the blurb from the Daily Express says it's going to blow your genitals off. And in a cinematic sense, I suppose it does. A couple of nuclear blasts have gone off, one at the North Pole, one at the South Pole, by the two antagonistic forces of the late 20th century. And it's knocked the Earth off its axis, which is what people are told at first. But then it's found out, and the Russians are the ones who leaked the information, that the Earth is spiraling into the sun. And what the movie does is it doesn't put it in the middle of things. It doesn't put giant telescopes on the screen and scientists in lab coats and people with calculating machines and all that kind of stuff in there. It situates the whole film in a newspaper office, the Daily Express in Fleet Street in London. Edward Judd plays Pete Stenning, an alcoholic journalist whose marriage has broken up and his wife has custody of his son, and he is kind of on the skids. Meanwhile, his best friend, the science editor of the newspaper, played by legendary Australian actor Leo McKern, his name is Bill Maguire, which is a good Australian name, starts to wonder about the heat waves that are affecting the world. Pete meets a woman who works for the Bureau of Meteorology called Jeannie, played by Janet Munro, and they kind of flirt and they build a relationship, just as Pete and Bill and the other people at the Daily Express are investigating the fact that the world is going to hell. There are sudden freak weather events. There are increasing number of extreme weather events. There's a ground fog in London. There's a hurricane and cyclone that hit London. Temperatures keep rising. Water becomes scarce. The Thames dries up. And gradually they come to the realization that the world is going to burn. One of the things that Val Guest does really interestingly with this, which he did in a previous movie he's called The Cruel City, is he's got a science fiction movie here with a broad science fiction concept and people trying to find out the truth of the scientific knowledge about what's happening. And he films it in a documentary style. He filmed it as much as possible on Fleet Street. He filmed it around London. He gave it as much of a documentary style as he possibly could. There are some scenes where the backgrounds are a little bit sketchy, but for the most part it really works. There's a real kind of groundedness to this, in the same way when you get with Quatermass and the Pit, with the people on the streets of London just as Hobbs End's being excavated and all that kind of stuff. The movie doesn't try to fake the locations. They did have a set, of course, for the newspaper office, but they based it very strongly on the Daily Express's newspaper office. The details are all precise and it kind of works. And the relationship between Edward Judd in his first starring role and Janet Munro, who was trying to establish herself as a grown-up actress after having been successful with a contract that she had with Disney to do Disney films for a while, but she really wanted to change her career. And this role is a very grown-up role. Jeannie's a well-lived character. It's a well-written character, a well-lived character, and she lives life on her own terms, and that works. And the dialogue in this movie is so sharp. One of the things that science fiction movies should really try and think about, apart from great special effects and getting decent actors, is the sharpness of the dialogue. You really need to have crisp dialogue for a decent science fiction movie, I think. So many of them, you've got all of the cliches of science fiction movies, like be careful, and people making jokes when they see something really crazy. But the dialogue in this one, amongst very literate people, because journalists of course have to be literate, and the dialogue between them, particularly Bill and Pete, is really, really sharp. The dialogue between Pete and Jeannie is really interesting and deep. You know, him going from alcoholic, cynical man to somebody who really wants to build a future with this woman, feels adult and more likely than you see in a lot of movies. So you've got great characters in this. You've got them using as much of the special effects budget as they can. The movie was made for only about £200,000, which wasn't a lot. And showing us a world that is getting hotter and drier with more extreme weather events. And even though at the time it was more about the threat of nuclear weapons and what nuclear weapons can do to our environment, it plays to me in the 21st century as a movie that could be about sudden global warming, the water rationing things, people getting typhus from using unclean water. All of those things are a condensed version of the existential threats we now face ourselves. And that makes the movie a lot more timely as well. Rewatching this, I enjoyed it more than I've ever enjoyed it the two other times I've seen it. I think it's a solid film. I think it's a solid film apart from being a science fiction movie as well. And I'm very glad that the British Film Institute have decided to preserve it. Now, the BFI version of it, which is the one I recommend you get, is great because it also has the booklet. And you've got to have the booklet in a decent movie restoration these days. It's got a review from the time. It's got an article about how Val Guest made the movie. It's got another review of the film and a whole bunch of other details. And the disc itself has a whole bunch of extras on it as well. It has 3 films from the BFI archive: Operation Hurricane, which is 33 minutes, The H-Bomb, which is 22 minutes, and The Hole in the Ground, which is 62 minutes. So these are documentary films about nuclear tests, which are added into this. You've got a commentary with Val Guest and Ted Newsom in there. You've got an interview many years later with Leo McKern, and you've also got a 34-minute documentary about the day the Earth caught fire. So you're getting your money's worth with this one. It really does give value, apart from the fact that this movie is really, really good. So they're the 2 reviews of my apocalyptic movies. I hope you enjoyed them, and if you did, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing the link. You can also hit the notification bell, and you can also support the channel by going to patreon.com/paleocinema. Saturday, I'm going to be doing a couple more science fiction movies, I think. I'm on a bit of a roll with this, and I want to reevaluate classic science fiction just that little bit more. I will move on to other genres soon, but just for this week, I think I'm going to go with science fiction and find 2 more science fiction movies from the past that I think are worth checking out. So anyway, look after yourselves, get the jab, and again, if you don't like that, too damn bad. Watch some good movies, watch some bad movies, watch some old science fiction movies that really punch above their weight. And I'll catch you next time.